Roman dodecahedron is remarkable and unusual, which are very difficult to create.
In a quiet corner of a museum in Germany sits a small object that has embarrassed archaeologists for over 200 years. It is bronze. It fits in the palm of a hand. It has 12 flat faces, each shaped like a perfect pentagon, and at every corner sits a small round knob. Every face has a hole cut through it, and strangely, no two holes are exactly the same size. It looks like a toy. It looks like a puzzle. It looks, to modern eyes, almost like a piece of alien technology dropped into the ancient world. And the truth is, after 2 centuries of study, nobody can say with certainty what it was for. This is the story of the Roman dodecahedron, one of the strangest, most persistent unsolved mysteries in all of archaeology. Not because the object is rare, though it is. Not because it is beautiful, though many of them are. But because an empire that documented almost everything, taxes, sandals, grain shipments, military campaigns, the price of bread, left us not a single word about this object. Not one inscription. Not one mention in a surviving text. Not one depiction in mosaic, fresco, or relief. For something the Romans clearly valued enough to cast in bronze using difficult techniques, the silence is deafening. And that silence is exactly why this story refuses to die. The first Roman dodecahedra were unearthed in the 18th century, scattered across what were once the northwestern provinces of the Roman Empire. Since then, archaeologists have cataloged just over 100 of them. The exact number depends on who's counting, and new fragments occasionally turn up in old museum drawers. Misfiled is something else entirely. That number alone should make you pause. The Romans were mass producers. When they made something useful, they made it in the thousands. Coins, oil lamps, military fittings, pottery, these turn up by the truckload at archaeological sites. But dodecahedron number only in the low hundreds worldwide after 2,000 years of digging. And the geography is even stranger. Almost every dodecahedron ever found comes from the western and northwestern provinces of the empire, what is now England, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Hungary. Not one has ever been recovered from Italy. Not one from Rome itself. Not one from the eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt, from Greece, from Syria, regions that were just as thoroughly Roman, just as densely populated, just as thoroughly excavated. Whatever these objects were, whoever made them and used them, the practice seems to have belonged specifically to the empire's northern frontier, the lands where Celtic and Germanic peoples lived under Roman rule, but never quite stopped being who they were before Rome arrived. The craftsmanship only deepens the puzzle. Many dodecahedra were cast in bronze as single, hollow pieces, a genuinely demanding feat for ancient metallurgy, requiring precise control of temperature and mold-making using the lost wax casting method. The knobs at each corner were sometimes cast separately and carefully fused on. The pentagonal faces are remarkably regular, almost geometrically obsessive in their symmetry, and yet the circular holes cut into each face vary in diameter from face to face, seemingly by design rather than accident. That detail, the deliberate irregularity of the holes on an otherwise symmetrical object, is one of the strongest clues we have, and also one of the most maddening, because it rules out almost every simple explanation while pointing toward none in particular. Whoever made these things invested real skill, real material, and real time into them. Bronze wasn't cheap. This wasn't a trinket carved by a bored soldier around a campfire. And yet these objects show almost no signs of the kind of heavy daily use you'd expect from a practical tool. Many specimens have smooth, unworn interiors and edges. Some show no wear patterns consistent with constant handling. They don't look like something used every day for years. They look like something brought out occasionally for a specific purpose and then put away. Over the decades, archaeologists have proposed dozens of explanations, and one by one, most of them have collapsed under the simplest of tests. Does the physical evidence actually support it? The most famous theory, and the one still repeated most often in casual conversation, is that dodecahedra were military rangefinders, tool soldiers supposedly used to calculate distances on the battlefield by looking through the holes and comparing how much of a distant object was visible through different size openings. It's an elegant idea. It's also almost certainly wrong. The holes vary wildly in size not just between different dodecahedra, but sometimes in ways that don't correspond to any consistent mathematical ratio you'd need for a functioning optical instrument. No two specimens use the same scale. No dodecahedron has ever been found alongside range tables, sighting equipment, or other military gear. and their find spots don't match the pattern you'd expect from military equipment. Many turn up in civilian settlements, graves, and rural sites far from any fort or garrison. A second popular theory suggests the objects were used as knitting gauges, specifically for measuring the finger sizes needed to knit gloves. A theory that gained some traction in amateur circles after modern hobbyists demonstrated that a dodecahedron's holes could, in principle, be used to size knitted fingers for gloves. It's a charming idea, and it does show that the object could function this way. But it runs into a historical problem. There is little solid evidence that Romans in these provinces were knitting gloves using techniques that would have required this kind of tool, and no dodecahedron has ever been found with wool fibers, dye residue, or fabric remains preserved inside or around it, despite favorable preservation conditions at some sites. A tool used constantly for textile work should occasionally leave some trace of that work behind. None has. Other theories have suggested the objects were candlestick holders, dice for games of chance, survey instruments for measuring pipe or rod diameters, devices for calculating the optimal sowing day for crops by tracking the angle of sunlight through the openings, or even ornamental scepter heads mounted on a staff. Each has some surface appeal, and each runs into the same wall. No consistent physical evidence, no wax residue, no game markings, no standardized calibration, no mounting sockets, survives to confirm any single use across the full range of specimens. The honest, frustrating truth is that no single explanation accounts for every dodecahedron ever found, and the objects themselves don't behave consistently enough to support one universal function. That inconsistency might be the most important clue of all. What if we've been asking the wrong question? What if there wasn't one purpose, but several, a ritual object, a status symbol, a marker of specific identity, something whose function was symbolic or social rather than mechanical? In the summer of 2023, a community archaeology dig near the village of Norton Disney in Lincolnshire, England, turned up something remarkable. A team of local volunteers, working an excavation that had already identified Roman-era foundations nearby, unearthed a dodecahedron in an exceptional state of preservation, its bronze surface still showing crisp detail, its corner knobs largely intact. The find generated genuine excitement, not just because such discoveries are rare, but because of the context surrounding it. The object was recovered from a pit alongside pottery fragments and animal bone, in a layer suggesting it had been deliberately placed there rather than simply lost. The Norton Disney find became something of a media sensation, and rightly so. It's one of the largest and best-preserved dodecahedra ever recovered from Britain, and one of relatively few found with reasonably clear archaeological context rather than being a stray, unprovenanced object bought from an antiquities dealer decades ago. That context matters enormously in archaeology. An object with a clear find spot, sealed in a specific layer alongside datable material, can tell us far more than an object sitting in a museum drawer with no record of where it came from. What the Norton Disney dodecahedron actually tells us, though, is more modest than headlines often suggest. It confirms, once again, that these objects were valued and sometimes deliberately deposited, buried with apparent intention rather than casually discarded, which lends weight to the idea that dodecahedra carried some kind of ritual or symbolic significance beyond simple utility. It does not, despite what some sensational retellings claim, come with a hidden laboratory revelation proving the objects were used in blood rituals or contained cremated human remains. No credible, published scientific analysis has demonstrated that. It's important to be honest about where the evidence actually stands, because the real mystery is compelling enough without needing to be dressed up with invented forensic drama. So why did the Romans never write about these objects? This is where the mystery becomes genuinely thought-provoking, even without manufactured claims of cover-ups and suppressed research. Roman writers were prolific chroniclers of daily life, law, and military affairs, but their surviving texts represent only a fraction of everything that was ever written in the ancient world. Countless documents, letters, provincial records, and regional accounts have simply been lost to time, eaten by fire, flood, war, and the plain fact that papyrus and wax tablets don't survive well in damp northern climates the way they occasionally do in the deserts of Egypt. It's entirely possible that dodecahedra were discussed in texts that no longer exist, records kept at a local or provincial level that never made it into the surviving canon of Roman literature we have access to today. There's also a simpler possibility that many archaeologists take seriously. These objects may have belonged to a non-Roman cultural practice that persisted quietly within Roman provinces. The empire ruled an enormous patchwork of conquered peoples, Celtic tribes in Gaul and Britain, Germanic communities along the Rhine, and while Rome imposed its laws, its language, and its administration on these regions, It didn't erase local customs, religious practices, or craft traditions overnight. Archaeologists have long noted that many uniquely regional artifacts, syncretic religious objects, and localized rituals persisted for generations under Roman rule without ever making their way into the mainstream Roman historical record, simply because Roman authors writing in Rome had little interest in cataloging the small-scale customs of provincial communities. A dodecahedron might not be a secret Rome buried. It might simply be a local or regional craft tradition that was never important enough, from the perspective of writers in the capital, to be worth recording. This doesn't make the mystery less interesting. If anything, it makes it more human. It suggests that history's silences aren't always sinister conspiracies. Sometimes they're simply the natural result of an empire's records reflecting the interests and biases of the people who kept them, while the everyday lives, crafts, and beliefs of ordinary provincial communities faded quietly into the archaeological record instead of the written one. Step back from the theories for a moment and just look at the object again. 12 pentagonal faces. A hole in each one, no two alike. Knobs at every corner. There is something almost deliberately playful about that design. A geometry lover's puzzle, cast in metal, meant perhaps as much to be admired and handled as to perform any single practical task. Ancient craftsmen and thinkers across the Mediterranean world were fascinated by geometric solids. The dodecahedron, with its 12 faces, held mathematical and even mystical significance in various philosophical traditions of the ancient world, often associated with cosmic or celestial symbolism. It's entirely possible, and this is speculation offered honestly as speculation, that Roman-era craftsmen in the provinces were drawn to the dodecahedron shape for reasons connected to this broader fascination with geometric perfection, adapting it into a locally meaningful object whose exact use was symbolic, ceremonial, or simply the mark of an object owned by someone of a certain status, rather than a tool with a single mechanical function at all. Some researchers have proposed that these objects functioned as a kind of ancient dice or gaming piece used in rituals of chance or divination, practices that were common across the ancient world and rarely left behind physical traces beyond the object itself. Others suggest they may have been ornamental finials, mounted atop staffs or standards carried in processions, their varying hole sizes purely decorative rather than functional. Still others have proposed they were simply a form of currency checking gauge, used by money changers or merchants to verify the diameters of coins in circulation, a theory that has some support in that several dodecahedra have hole sizes roughly corresponding to the diameters of Roman coin denominations, though this too remains unproven and contested. The honest answer, the one every serious archaeologist gives when pressed, is that we don't know. And we may never know for certain, because the kind of evidence that would definitively answer the question, a contemporary written description, depiction showing the object in use, or an unambiguous manufacturing record, simply hasn't survived, if it ever existed at all. There's something worth sitting with here, and it isn't a hidden conspiracy or a suppressed revelation. It's the plain, slightly unsettling fact that even a civilization as thoroughly documented as Rome, a civilization whose laws, wars, emperors, and everyday transactions we know down to remarkable detail, still has blind spots. Entire practices, entire objects, entire corners of daily life among Rome's provincial subjects that simply never made it into the historical record we've inherited. The Roman dodecahedron endures as a mystery not because someone is hiding the truth, but because history itself is full of holes, no pun intended, and archaeology is often the only tool we have to peer through them. Every theory about these objects, from the plausible to the far-fetched, is really an attempt to fill a silence with meaning. Maybe it was a tool. Maybe it was a toy. Maybe it was sacred. Maybe it was simply beautiful, and that alone was reason enough for someone 2,000 years ago to spend the time and bronze required to make it. What we can say with confidence is this: dozens of these objects were made, almost exclusively along the empire's northwestern frontier, by skilled hands, using techniques that required real expertise, and they were valued enough to be kept, sometimes for generations, before being lost, buried, or deliberately placed in the ground. Beyond that, the dodecahedron keeps its secrets. And maybe that's exactly why 2,000 years later we're still talking about it. Not because the mystery has been solved, and certainly not because the answer is dark or disturbing, but because it hasn't been solved, and the not knowing is what keeps pulling us back to that small, strange, 12-sided shape sitting quietly in glass cases across Europe, waiting for someone someday to finally understand it. Until that day comes, the Roman dodecahedron remains exactly what it has always been, one of history's most elegant, most stubborn, and most genuinely honest mysteries. A reminder that even the most thoroughly recorded civilizations in human history still left us questions with no answers, buried in bronze, waiting patiently in the dirt.